Hello and welcome to Crash Course Genshin Impact. My name is Frankie, I am your host, and your lore diver. I've got my scuba mask on and I'm ready to go. Okay, we're going to talk about a few things today, namely a few ancient civilizations. After doing some research, I've realized that a lot of these ancient, long-destroyed civilizations across Teyvat have a lot of key details and events in common, which has made me wonder if these recurring parallels could be foreshadowing future events or could help predict the details of past events that we don't know much about yet. I'm mainly talking about Conria with this one. We do have a few nebulous ideas about basically what happened, but nobody we ask about it will give us any substantial information. And what we've gleaned from object descriptions is confusing at best and contradictory or biased at worst. And we'll get into that. So I'm thinking this is going to be a little series of its own, researching the ancient civilizations of Teyvat and picking out all the little details to see what's specific to that civilization and what seems to be a recurring theme across the board. So let's get into it. We're going to kick things off in Sumeru, starting with the city of Gurabad. Gurabad, also known as the City of Brass or the City of Kings, was an ancient city located in the southwestern part of the desert of Hadramaveth in Sumeru. It rose after the death of the goddess of flowers and fell sometime before King Deshret fucked around and found out. By fucked around, I mean his people went mad from forbidden knowledge, and by found out, I mean he ended up sacrificing himself to try and save them, but that inevitably failed. There are a couple sources in the game where we can get the history of Gurabad from its rise to its inevitable fall. Starting with the Desert Pavilion Chronicle artifact set, the founding of Gurabad is described in the flower of this set, the first days of the City of Kings, saying, "Gurabad bloomed like a man-made flower in a cliff wall, becoming the capital of the mortals." The city of Gurabad was established by a former shepherd named Ormazd, who had become one of the vassal kings to King Deshret. Ormazd fell in love with the djinn Lilapar, who you may remember from the Desert of Hadramaveth world quest. She's the djinn in a bottle that acts as our kinda bitchy guide, and allows us to see through the never-ending sandstorms in the area. Well, it turns out that Lilapar has some pretty valid reasons to be kind of a bitch, because Ormazd would go on to betray Lilapar after using her blessing to rise to power in the first place and unite the desert peoples, which is super fucked up. Now, Lilapar had warned Ormazd against falling in love with her to begin with, saying, "The mad love that we djinn possess is chained to greed and want, and carries with it self-deigned retribution." Ormazd, of course, does not heed this warning, and when he grew corrupt with power and perpetuated the slavery Lilapar had expected him to abolish, Ormazd got what was coming for him. What was coming for him was 3 generations of ruination, in the words of Lilapar, as stated in the circlet of this set, Legacy of the Desert Highborn. These 3 generations of ruination are described in the book The Tale of Shiruyeh and Shirin, in which Lilapar gives birth to her daughter with Ormazd, Shirin, and then immediately also gives 3 prophecies. The TLDR of which, first, Shirin will marry a hero and their kid will surpass that hero. Second, Shirin's relatives would meet a sweet end. And third, Shirin alone will inherit the throne of Gurabad. Now, the first of these happened when Ormazd adopted an orphan named Kisra, who was secretly also Lilapar's son, and named him Parvez as a reward for his many accomplishments, then married him off to Shirin. The second happened when Shirin, who was forbidden from joining her father for dinner at Lilapar's command, delivered poisoned honey to Ormazd and all of her other siblings, except Kisra. So, like, a sweet end. Get it? Now, Shirin and Kisra, who after the death of Ormazd named himself Parvezravan, had a son named Shiruyeh. Shiruyeh was beloved by his mother, but his father forced him to wear a brass mask to hide his face and banished him from Gurabad. Why? Because according to Lilapar's prophecies, Shiruyeh was destined to surpass him. Shirin took this opportunity to plot against her husband, who she didn't care for, so she disguised herself and met with her son in secret, giving him a false prophecy. Since the moonlight has granted you a good bow and a sharp blade, why do you suffer that coward idling upon the throne? Shiruyeh would go on to stab his father to death in his sleep, then beg his mother for forgiveness, which of course she did. Shiruyeh then claimed the throne, but he was tormented by nightmares, and on one frenzied night of wandering, he fell into a deep black chasm in the earth and disappeared. What? Now, that is the tale of Shiruyeh and Shirin's version of events, which differ pretty significantly from the version of events as described in the Desert Pavilion Chronicle, as well as the Dirge of Bilqis world quest. For one, Lillipar's heavy involvement in the events as described is completely omitted. The Dirge of Bilqis specifically reveals that Shirin's plot to poison her family was actually Lillipar's. Not only that, but it was Lillipar, not Shirin, who encouraged Shiruyeh to kill his father. Another big difference is the manner of Parvez Ravan's death. In the book, Shiruyeh kills him in his sleep. But in Lillipar's memories, as described in the world quest Memories of Gurabad, Shiruyeh gathers his followers and launches an open rebellion on his father. Then, in one final attack from Lillipar, Parvez Ravan turns into a dark monster. You see, Lillipar had used the power of the Dark Abyss in her final act of revenge against the city of Gurabad. This is what Lillipar recalls of those events in Memories of Gurabad. Finally, you see the brass-masked king. He flees into the shadows, into Shirin's arms. And then there is King Kisra, who turned into a dark monster. They are all your flesh and blood, yet you rejoice, and you exult in that retribution. Now, why would Lillipar want revenge against her own son? Well, interestingly, it was Lillipar herself who, in a dream, gave Parvez Ravan the idea of creating a massive machine to mass-produce machinery driven by jinni spirits. These machines would make Parvez Ravan wicked rich at the cost of increasing socioeconomic disparities in Gurabad as machines began to replace many jobs. Not to mention Shirin, who had long since gone insane after being led by her mother to poison and kill, like, almost her entire family, was in charge of making the jinn to power these machines, and those jinn ended up mindless and malformed. The timepiece of the Lost Path contains a collection of the cries for mercy of the jinn forced to inhabit these machines, and it's a devastatingly fucked up read. In the end, Lillipar's use of abyssal power destroys a large part of Gurabad. When talking about Shiruyeh and his followers, Lillipar tells us, the earth swallowed them whole, and they fell into a dark chasm together with the entire city. As for the Gurabad of today, there are ruins of the city scattered around the desert of Hadramaveth, but those ruins are few and far between, because again, lots of the city was just straight up swallowed by the abyss. Another interesting thing about Gurabad's ruins is that one of the 3 massive Conrian ruin golems in Sumeru can be found there, as referenced in one of Zandik or Dotore's notes. In the end, the fall of Gurabad was largely orchestrated by Lillipar herself in 3 generations of vengeance against her human lover Ormazd, after witnessing the corrupting forces of power and wealth on the human heart, something that would continue to happen over the course of Gurabad's history, further fueling Lillipar's revenge. Before we get into the next desert city-state, we need to talk a bit about King Deshret, or more importantly, his civilization. So the rough timeline of what we know about the desert's various civilizations starts with the 3 eternal companion gods. These were King Deshret, Nabu Malikata, also known as the Goddess of Flowers, and Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, who would become the Dendro Archon. All 3 gods were allies, and by the time the Archon Wars rolled around, were already sharing Deshret's throne and ruling together. Each god had their own views on wisdom, and they often had friendly debates about their varying beliefs. We don't know much else about their shared civilization other than the peace and prosperity they experienced, but it is possible that the promised land of Valivija mentioned in the tale of Shiruyeh and Shirin was referring to the kingdom of those companion gods. The TLDR of the fall of that kingdom is that Deshret openly opposed the heavenly principles. Nabu Malikata agreed to help him obtain higher knowledge that could help him, but warned him it would come at a great cost. Upon hearing their plan, Rukkhadevata parted ways with her two companions and left with her people for the rainforest. Nabu Malikata ended up sacrificing herself to show Deshret the path to this higher knowledge, resulting in a celestial nail being dropped in the desert of Hadramavath, turning her sacred oasis into a never-ending sandstorm. In the end, King Deshret was left to rule over the desert alone. Before building his kingdom, Deshret made a deal with the Dendro Dragon sovereign Apep, who claimed dominion over the desert. This deal allowed King Deshret to build his civilization undisturbed, with the understanding that when Deshret died, Apep would consume him in order to absorb his knowledge, in the hopes that Apep could use any higher knowledge Deshret would gain against the heavenly principles. This explains why when we meet Apep in the game, it has what is described as an apocalypse happening inside it that we have to cleanse, because it literally consumed Deshret and his forbidden knowledge. Interestingly, Apep claims it didn't care much for King Deshret. However, the Lost Hermitage viewpoint describes Apep as a friend of Deshret who held court in the caverns underneath the desert of Hadramavath. King Deshret wanted to create a utopia in the desert, free of worry, schemes, and slavery. The Jinn, who had been created by Nabu Malikata, became Deshret's envoys and messengers to humanity. He set out to find humans untainted by the allure of corruption to act as his vassal kings, as described in the Desert Pavilion Chronicle artifact set. Deshret also founded a royal city, Akhtamun, in what is now Aru village, which is likely where he continued to obsessively research this higher knowledge Malikata had sacrificed herself to guide him toward. Speaking of Desert Pavilion Chronicle, it's the feather of this set, End of the Golden Realm, that tells us Gurabad fell to this black plague, and the Lord of the Red Sands fell upon the path of self-destruction. After the fall of Gurabad, Deshret set out to create something called Aru. The quest item Record of Aru's Shut says, it won't be long before Aru becomes capable of encompassing the desert in its entirety, just as Lord Al-Ahmar had prophesied. We're not entirely sure what Aru was. It may have been related to the Golden Slumber at Kajnisut, or perhaps a mechanism with which he could project the Golden Slumber onto the entirety of the desert. Regardless, the intention of Aru was to prevent something like the fall of Gurabad from happening again. In Aru, none would have to experience age, decay, hunger, thirst, or sadness. But the deeper Deshret fell into his obsession with forbidden knowledge, the less and less benevolent his reasoning became. In the end, what drove Deshret to unleash forbidden knowledge onto the desert, driving his people mad, as well as bringing the withering and the disease Elazar into existence, was not the wish for an idyllic utopia for the people, but rather his own nostalgia and longing for the days of the eternal companion gods. Now, Rukkhadevata, compelled by her former friendship with Deshret and their shared grief over the death of Malikata, returned to the desert and instructed priests to build temples with the power of life in order to counter the effects of forbidden knowledge on the land. But it wasn't enough, which eventually led Deshret to sacrifice his life, temporarily ending the forbidden knowledge disaster. Those temples, or what's left of them, are still scattered across the desert, but the desert people of today refer to them as the Towers of Betrayal. Around 100 years after the death of King Deshret and the fall of his civilization, a man named Shah Ramshar built 7 towers across the desert, each with a great sage, and the cities around them became known as the Cities of the 7 Towers. The only cities we know for certain were a part of this collective were Ai-Khanum, Tulaytula, and Saleh, as listed on a Primal Obelisk under the mausoleum of King Deshret. It's also likely that a new Gurabad built upon the ruins of the former Gurabad was one of the 7 cities, but it's never explicitly confirmed. Ai-Khanum, also known as the City of the Moon Maiden and City of Amphitheaters, was an ancient city originally ruled by both Nabu Malikata and King Deshret, and populated by the Jinn. According to the Flowers of Paradise Lost artifact set, Nabu Malikata was a survivor of the Seelie race who was exiled to Teyvat after the war between the Primordial One and the Second who came. The flower of this set, Aikanum's Myriad, describes the creation of Nabu Malikata's desert oases. Legend has it that the Lord of Flowers wandered the barren wastes for 72 nights. Her heels were worn through by the merciless gravel. Her wounds gushed into limpid springs, turning into streams with no boundaries. Thence those streams flowed into verdant gardens, from which sprouted night blue water lilies. Water lilies are the mothers of the Jinn, and the Jinn were birthed from the intoxicating dreams and the bitter memories of loss. There are two theories as to where Aikanum was probably located. The first is the one-time domain Altar of Mirages, located in the hypostyle desert near the mausoleum of King Deshret. The description of this domain tells us the Jinn once used this place as a free theater and a paradise without sorrow or care. Given that Aikanum was also known as the City of Amphitheaters, as well as home to the Jinn, I personally think this location makes the most sense. The other theory is that the eternal oasis at the center of the desert of Hadramaveth was Aikanum, but I don't think this is the case, simply because we know that Aikanum either survived long after both Malikata and Deshret died, or was rebuilt at some point. However, the never-ending sandstorm present on top of the eternal oasis would make that impossible. The only thing we know of Aikanum in the age of the Cities of the Seven Towers is that it fell under the thumb of Garshasp, who later gained control of several other desert cities but was ultimately killed. Another one of the Primal Obelisks under the mausoleum of King Deshret says this about Garshasp. Garshasp destroyed all the bandits, and thus did the kings bow to him, naming him Muazzam Kagan, Kagan of Kagans. He abandoned Gorabad and set up blank as the capital. Garshasp Kagan fell, and the capital burned for 7 days. Tulatila, also known as the City of Sapphires, was located in the hypostyle desert north of the mausoleum of King Deshret. The only thing left of it now is its Garden of Endless Pillars, a one-time domain in that area. Tulatila actually predated the Seven Towers built by Ramshar as well, being one of the human-led city-states left in shambles following the death of Deshret. The city became known as the home of the Tainarians, though the Tainarians were not originally from Tulatila, but were instead brought to the city by Hermanubis, who established the original Temple of Silence there and used his power to keep the remnants of forbidden knowledge at bay. Because of this, Tulatila also became known as the City of Wisdom. Following the death of Ramshar, Tulatila was ruled by King Humayun Gurkhan. He was killed in a Jinn uprising that happened in Saleh, but the city of Tulatila doesn't appear to have suffered that loss very much, because only a few years later, refugees from an unnamed city flocked to Tulatila following the death of Garshasp. According to the Temple of Silence's records, a king of the new and improved Gorabad attacked Tulatila at some point, and demanded ownership of the temple as a reward for his victory. The ruling elite of Tulatila sided with this king as a power grab and painted the temple and all its recorded wisdom as the true source of corruption and forbidden knowledge. Hermanubis had used all of his power to keep forbidden knowledge at bay, and in order to save the temple, broke himself into many pieces and did a ritual to pass down his power and knowledge to his mortal followers. This allowed the temple to defeat the invading army, but the people of Tulatila were freaked the fuck out by Hermanubis' ritual and immediately shunned the temple as a result. This led the Tainarians to leave Tulatila, instead relocating to the rainforest, which is why Tainari is a rainforest boy and decidedly not a desert boy. This is also why the current location of the new and improved Temple of Silence is not in the ruins of Tulatila. As for the fall of Tulatila, it's complicated politics, interpersonal drama shit. So, Tulatila was now ruled by an elite class of nobles and scholars. To keep the current leader, Badana, happy, the nobles gave him a concubine, Makaira, a beautiful sword dancer and descendant of the Jinn. Makaira conspired with Badana's son, Faramarz, to kill Badana, resulting in a power struggle in which Makaira was constantly shifting loyalties, namely between her 3 lovers, Faramarz, Shifos, and Balash. Balash became ruler after Badana's death, who was then killed by Goraz, who took Makaira as his wife, At this point, Faramars was fed the fuck up with Makaira's constant side-switching, and ended up killing her by poisoning her with viper venom, after which Faramars was exiled to the rainforest. After that, Makaira's other lover, Shiphos, who was the prince of a fallen kingdom who had embarked on a journey to revive his kingdom, became the protector of Tuletula. However, the ruling elite, as well as kings from other cities, felt threatened by his power, and for that, Faramars came back in one final hurrah to kill Shiphos for the money, then vanish into the rainforest. Again. And without the protection of Shiphos, the city of Tuletula faded away completely, leaving only its garden of endless pillars behind. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Saleh, also known as the Electrum City of Warriors and the City of the Thamudians. Saleh was located near Thamud Oasis in the Lower Setek region. The viewpoint Thamud Oasis has this to say about Saleh. The golden-eyed Thamudians and the 7 walls of their magnificent city-state rose up over the corpses of ancient kingdoms, and would itself be sucked down into the vortex of wars between nations and obliterated. Saleh was ruled by a khaganate, the first of which was Turan. Following the death of Shah-Ramshar, his young son Artaxir took the throne, but died soon after, and Turan, formerly minister to Ramshar, assumed the throne. For this, many attributed the death of Artaxir to Turan, painting him as a traitor. Turan and his 3 sons were later executed. Then King Humayun, who you may remember from Tuletula, assumed control over Saleh as well, thus leading to his death during the Jinn uprising that took place there. Later, Saleh would also fall under Badana's rule, then Balash, then Goraz, you get the picture. The people of Saleh attempted to rebel and re-establish their original Khaganate system, but in order to appease them, Makaira sent the rebels Goraz's decapitated head. And that worked? Seemingly all that is left of the golden-eyed Thamudian city is the Thamud Oasis in the Lower Setek region. Something I find very interesting is that the new location of the Temple of Silence is at Thamud Oasis. A temple that works to preserve as much recorded history as possible, founded by the Tainarians, that now resides in the ruins of a civilization of golden-eyed people. I will never not be haunted by Istaroth, I think. I think this is just my life now. So, to wrap up this very, very, very dense episode, I wanted to share some of my final thoughts about the Sumeru Desert, as well as some theories I've developed while researching and refamiliarizing myself with the Sumeru Desert lore over the past few weeks. Starting off with King Deshret's relatively amicable relationship with Apep, which is interesting to me specifically because of how it parallels really closely with the allyship we learned that King Remus of Remuria had with Scylla, the Prince of Bishops. Remus himself was originally from Sumeru, so either Sumerian god kings just get along really well with dragons, or there's an important parallel here we should be paying attention to. Specifically, the idea of Apep purposefully consuming Deshret for his forbidden knowledge kind of reminded me of the fact that King Nibelung, the heavenly father of the dragons according to Nivelette, left Tevat and returned with abyssal power to fight the heavenly principles with. I suddenly have a lot of thoughts about this. More on that another day. It was also through researching Sumeru's history that I realized King Deshret likely used fragments of the celestial nail dropped in the desert of Hadramaveth in all of his technology and machinery. Let me explain. The most important thing to understand here is that Nabu Malikata did not sacrifice herself to just implant what is referred to as hidden knowledge into his brain suddenly. She sacrificed herself to create a path for him to use to obtain that knowledge. We get the specific wording of her plan from the Secret Keeper's magic bottle in the Flowers of Paradise Lost set. I shall fashion you a bridge to allow you to slake your deepest wants, but you must not fear the crystalline sapphire nail. This, of course, being the celestial nail that essentially smited Malikata. We also know that whatever it was Malikata sacrificed to give him or guide him toward, Deshret had to study and research for a very long time. We know this because in the canon of the game, the original city of Gurabad rose after the death of Nabu Malikata and fell before Deshret's forbidden knowledge incident, after which Deshret died. The original city of Gurabad lasted for 3 generations, and during all of this, King Deshret was researching and studying this hidden taboo knowledge. It's never explicitly stated what exactly Deshret was studying, but I have good reason to believe that it was the Celestial Nail. Because I genuinely think Malikata's entire plan was to summon a Celestial Nail for Deshret to study and use. Specifically, the wording, "fear not the crystalline sapphire nail," interests me. Because in what world would Deshret not immediately fear the big-ass Celestial Nail that just smited his lover? Because that was Malikata's entire plan. The nail was the path that she created to hidden knowledge. The Secret Keeper's magic bottle goes on to say, "Wreathed in darkness, she guided her dearest friend toward the path to understanding all there was to know about the skies and the abyss. Using her body as a conduit and offering the oasis in trade, she let the dazzling radiance consume her to see his deepest desires be made manifest." Homegirl manifested a divine nail for her boyfriend to study, and it worked. Now, it does say that she was wreathed in darkness, which is most likely a reference to abyssal power, but that darkness is not the end goal here. When the Celestial Nail strikes, she allows the dazzling radiance to consume her to see his deepest desires made manifest, meaning the something that appears in response to her actions is the key to the hidden knowledge she wants Deshret to find. And what appears in response to her actions is the Celestial Nail. The reason she used abyssal power to summon it is because the nails have historically been used to suppress the abyss. Not only that, but if you compare and contrast the blue stones inlaid in most, if not all, of Deshret's technology with the crystalline sapphire found in the Celestial Nails, it becomes increasingly clear that the nail was the key. The nail was what Deshret spent years studying and researching in secret. Speaking of crystalline sapphire, the history of Tule-Tula, also known as the City of Sapphires, has a lot of major parallels with the history of Celestia, or more broadly speaking, the divine as we know it in Teyvat. And from those parallels, I think we can draw some fascinating conclusions about what might have happened to the first, second, and third descenders. Okay, let me cook. Shah Ramshar, who established the 7 towers across the desert, each with its own great sage, thereby establishing the collective cities of these 7 towers. Ramshar dies, and King Humayun rises to power in Tule-Tula, only to be killed in a Jinn uprising. Hermanubis performs a ritual to break himself into multiple pieces so that he can pass down his power and knowledge to his mortal followers, and with it, the ability to defend the Temple of Silence from an invading army. Are you picking up what I'm putting down? I don't think it's a perfect one-to-one parallel, but I do think there are a lot of important details we can glean from these very blatant similarities. Specifically, Hermanubis stands out to me, because the fact that he purposefully broke himself into multiple pieces to pass down his power and knowledge could very well imply that the third descender may have willingly sacrificed themselves to become the Gnosis. But the parallels don't end there, because I haven't even mentioned Tule-Tula's equivalent of the fourth descender, and that is Shiphos. Shiphos, the prince of a fallen kingdom who had embarked on a journey to revive his kingdom. Shiphos, a type of Iron Age Greek short sword, the name of which means penetrating light. You know what's interesting about the Traveler? Our closest companion is Paimon. Now, Paimon is a demon name, specifically the name of the demon who was most loyal to Lucifer Morningstar. Lucifer, a name that means light bringer. Tule-Tula fell after the death of Shiphos, and left only its garden of endless pillars behind. You know how the loading screen for Genshin Impact is just a series of seemingly never-ending pillars that look identical to the celestial nails filled with crystalline sapphire? You know how the sky in Teyvat is fake? So this right here is my theory, and I genuinely, firmly believe this. The sky we see in Teyvat is nothing more than a projection of what it used to look like. It's why we have an omnipresent full moon that never changes, as well as an omnipresent Celestia hovering at a fixed point over Chenyu Vale. The thing is, we know that Celestia can move. There are murals in the ruins of Dragonspine and Surumi Island that depict Celestia's presence directly over these places. There's a very real chance that the Celestia we see over Chenyu Vale is just a projection of the last place it was seen in One Piece. There's also a chance that the last time it was seen in One Piece was 500 years ago, when we tried to leave, when our twin claims, the heavenly principles, fell asleep. I'm saying I think Celestia was destroyed, and left only a garden of endless pillars behind. And that's where I'm going to end this episode, because otherwise we're going to be sitting here for perhaps days on end discussing the desert. Truly, when I say that I was researching this shit for weeks, I do mean it took weeks just to get through all of the information I could find from all of the sources that I could find about the desert and its history and the many civilizations that have historically been there. It's like, it's not that I forgot how vast and expansive and content heavy the Sumeru region as a whole was, but it feels like there was so much to get through, and I think a lot of people got really burned out, especially when it came to exploration of the desert, that it became kind of hard to really dig into and pay attention to the story as we were receiving it. Not to mention that they do the traditional Genshin thing where in order to get a lot of the facts, you do have to dig for it. Like, most if not all of the information I have about the cities of the Seven Towers came from fucking Primal Obelisks underneath the mausoleum of King Deshret that are extremely worn, and we only have bits and pieces of what was inscribed on them. Are you kidding me? Which is not to say it was not a lot of fun to dig into this and find so much stuff. It was really fun, and also really sad, because it reminded me of the doomed polycule, and I try not to think about them too much, or I'll get really sad. If I think about King Deshret too much, I'll get so sad and so overwhelmed with lore. God, when I realized that the blue gems, and genuinely, I encourage you to go run around the Sumeru Desert and look for blue gems in anything, any construct created by Deshret. They're everywhere, and they're identical to the blue crystalline sapphire in the celestial nails. They're identical. Man, what did Deshret do? Did he fucking disassemble a celestial nail and study it under a microscope? What are you insane? I love that, actually. I love that. And I mentioned this on TikTok a while ago, and somebody commented that maybe that's why the desert ruins are still preserved. All of these constructs, all of these machines and robots are still functional to this day. Like the crystalline sapphire may be what's preserving it, which I find fascinating. I think that's so cool if that's the case. God, this was a lot of fun. And I had a lot of fun running around the Sumeru Desert and just remembering all of the stories that I kind of, lost track of as I was going through all of the world quests in that area initially. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, a lot of really fascinating stories, and I encourage you to look into them. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I know that this was a long and a dense one. If you're interested, I'm going to put a list of all of my sources in the description. If you like my content, you can find me on TikTok, Fantasy Costco. You can also find me twitch.tv/FrankieDangerDays. Both of those will also be in the description. And I will see you guys next time on Crash Course Genshin Impact.